Well, anytime you've got a first-time starting quarterback, that could be a weakness. Not just his development, but his continuity with new receivers and some missing pieces along the offensive line that they've had to replace. Of course, they've lost a couple of the very best up front. That comes to mind. I don't know that defensively I think that this could be one of the better Alabama defenses that we've seen since 2016.
I've said that the last 2 years. I'm in the wrong.
Well, I'm wrong myself quite often. So
yeah. No, I would agree. I think that this year has the best chance of being more like that 2016 defense. And that was a really good. That was my favorite defense. That 2016 defense was probably my favorite Alabama defense in the Nick Saban era. Just so many guys that could do so many things. It was a very athletic group of guys that was on that defense. I think Deshaun Ham is probably one of my favorite defensive players that year. Just a tremendous athlete. My second question is, you know a lot more about Ohio State football than I do, as far as the ins and outs of their roster and what they have. I know watching, watching the national championship last year and watching a few games that I did catch. Do you think that as far as their weakness, do you think that their defensive back group is probably the weakest link in their secondary?
So before I move on to the Buckeyes, I will just add on to the quarterback portion of that, just to say, with Alabama, the analysis is that you always have the 4 and 5 stars replacing the 4 and 5 stars. So it never has anything to do with talent. It just has to do with continuity. And of course, continuity is most important along the offensive line. And anytime you lose offensive linemen that fit the system, knew what they were doing, and were as talented as the guys that they're losing, and you got to replace them, there's always a concern about chemistry, because that unit has to be more in sync than any other unit. And then if you follow my point here, the wide receivers are going to be explosive, fast, they'll catch the ball, all that. But the level of wide receiver play the last 3 years, 18, 19, and 20, was so ridiculous that maybe the receivers, they'll just be really good. But the level of play at that position the last 3 years has been basically historic. So there might be a drop off there, but they could still be a top 5 receiver unit in the country, but there could still be a drop off. Okay, on to Ohio State. I've said this to a few different people. I don't know when was the last time that Ohio State did not return one player in the secondary that I consider a plus player, meaning a player that, they're 4 and 5 stars, basically 4 stars across the board in the secondary, but they don't have anybody coming back that I would say that guy is an all-conference player. He's an All-American candidate. They have a couple. Seven Banks would be one. That's good player. He does his job. He's a really good player. But this is the first time in maybe like the 80s that I can not find a player in the secondary where I say that guy's an excellent player. He's an excellent player on down the line. The secondary, until they prove otherwise, is, I don't want to call it a mess. That would be a stretch. They should be better, just because they were really banged up before the season. They had already missed some guys, and then during the season, even though it was a short season, so they get those guys back, and just by sheer numbers, they should be able to find players that are going to step up and play well. But the secondary by far is the biggest question mark and the worst unit on the Ohio State football team.
And why do you think it is that we had a guy, I don't know if you've heard of this guy that Alabama recruited for the 2021 class, named, ironically, Devontae Smith, right out of Ohio State. who was at one time committed to Ohio State. Is it the position coach at Ohio State that just isn't able to develop these guys, or is it the lack of being able to, I mean, they have good recruiting classes every year. Jordan Battle at one time was an Ohio State commit.
Mm-hmm.
So you have some of these elite guys, going to Alabama and elsewhere, who are right out of the state of Ohio, and they're going to other programs. I'm just curious to know why that is, and if you might think that might be due to the position coach.
Well, their recruiting in the secondary has always been fine. If you just look at the level of cornerbacks and safeties that they recruit and how highly they're rated, that's not been anywhere close to an issue. Now, losing players out of the state of Ohio, I don't necessarily think that's been an issue. There's basically not a major school in any state that locks up all their best players. I think it has more to do with scheme and development not being as high as it needs to be the last couple of years, and then combined with, in this particular season of 2020, they got hit with a couple of key injuries before the season started. Guys were knocked out before the season started, and then they lost think of it this way. In the previous year's playoff game, Shaun Wade was their best, he was their best returning player going into 2020, and he was ejected from the playoff game against Clemson. His replacement was kicked off the team for violations against women and running amok there. So, they lost one of their top 5 or 6 players from a domestic violence situation, got kicked off the team, and then they lost 2 other players before the season ever started due to season-ending injuries. So injuries are kind of an excuse, but it was legit that they lost 3 of probably their top 6 or 7 in the rotation before the season ever started.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, that makes a little bit more sense. I just, I'm not as entrenched in the Ohio State, aspects of the ins and outs of that program as much as I am Alabama. So I'm a little bit, way more familiar with that. So I didn't know what was going on there. No, like I said, they've always recruited. The last 2 years, they've recruited last 4 years, really, they've recruited very, very well. It's just that one position seems to be, one position group that just hasn't really hit on all cylinders. They had that one guy they got drafted to go to the Lions a few years ago, and he was a great defensive back. But other than that, they haven't had a stellar group that I can that I've seen.
Well, it's really just been 2020. From the time Urban Meyer stepped on campus all the way through the 2019 season, they've had just droves of first-round defensive backs.